You see a man standing in the rain outside a Charleston auction house in 1800, his clothes soaked through, his hands trembling not from cold but from something else entirely, something that would have seemed impossible to every person who walked past him that day, because this man, Robert Reed Church Sr., born into bondage, purchased as property, branded as less than human, is about to do something that defies every rule of the world he was born into. He's about to buy his freedom. But that's just the beginning, because in exactly 10 years, this formerly enslaved man will own more property than the white plantation owner who once claimed to own him. And the story of how he did it, the strategy he used, the risks he took, the system he exploited from within, it's a blueprint that terrifies people even today because it proves something that slavery's defenders desperately needed everyone to believe was impossible, that given even the smallest opportunity, even the most restricted freedom, Black Americans could outthink, outwork, and outcompete the very system designed to keep them in chains. But Robert Church's story isn't just about one man's triumph. It's about a hidden economy that existed in the shadows of slavery, a network of Black entrepreneurs, skilled laborers, and financial geniuses who accumulated wealth in ways that directly threatened the narrative that justified their enslavement, and understanding how they did it, understanding the specific tactics they used and the incredible obstacles they overcame, it reveals something profound about American capitalism, about Black excellence, and about why so many of these stories were systematically erased from history books. Because if people knew the truth about how many formerly enslaved people became wealthier than their former masters, if they understood the economic sophistication and business acumen of Black Americans operating under the most oppressive conditions imaginable, it would shatter comfortable myths about who built America's wealth and who deserves credit for its prosperity. Let me take you back to 1851, to a steamboat called the Lucy Walker on the Mississippi River, where Robert Church, still enslaved at that moment, works as a steward, and you need to understand something crucial about the steamboat economy of the antebellum South. These floating palaces weren't just transportation. They were the lifeblood of Southern commerce, carrying cotton, slaves, wealthy passengers, and unimaginable amounts of money up and down the river, and enslaved workers on these boats occupied a unique position in the slavery system. They could move between cities, interact with free Black people, handle money, develop skills, and most importantly, they could earn tips, sometimes substantial tips from wealthy passengers who appreciated good service. And Church, brilliant and calculating even as a young man enslaved on that boat, understood something that most people around him didn't. He understood that every dollar he could save, every skill he could acquire, every connection he could make was a tool he could use to buy something more valuable than anything you could hold in your hands, his freedom and his family's freedom. The Lucy Walker exploded in 1851, a boiler explosion that killed dozens of people, and Church barely survived, his body scarred by burns that he would carry for the rest of his life. But something else survived that explosion too, his determination, his savings, his plan, and by 1862, with the Civil War raging and the old order beginning to crack, Church had saved enough money to do what thousands of enslaved people across the South were doing in those chaotic years. He purchased his freedom, paying his enslaver for the right to own himself, and you might think that's where this story ends, with a man finally free after decades in bondage, but you'd be completely wrong, because Church looked at Memphis, Tennessee, a city devastated by war, abandoned by many of its white residents who fled the approaching Union Army, its economy in ruins, its property values collapsed, and where everyone else saw disaster, Church saw the opportunity of a lifetime. Here's what Church understood that most people didn't: war destroys old wealth but creates new opportunities. And the collapse of Confederate Memphis meant that property, businesses, and assets were suddenly available at prices that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. And while Memphis's white elite were either gone or reeling from the collapse of the slave economy that had made them rich, Church had something they desperately needed: cash, skills, and the willingness to invest in a city that most people had written off. He started with a saloon, and you need to understand what a saloon meant in Reconstruction-era Memphis. It wasn't just a bar, it was a banking institution for working people, a place where men cashed their paychecks, conducted business deals, heard about job opportunities, and networked with people who could help them rise. And Church ran his saloon brilliantly, not just as a business but as an intelligence-gathering operation. Every conversation he overheard, every transaction he witnessed, every piece of information about property values, business opportunities, or economic changes in Memphis, he filed it away and used it to make his next move, and his next move after that, building wealth not through one big score but through dozens of calculated decisions, each one building on the last. By 1866, just 4 years after purchasing his freedom, Church owned multiple properties in Memphis. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because Church didn't just buy property. He bought property that white Memphis wanted, property in areas that were being rebuilt, property along key commercial corridors, property that would become valuable as Memphis recovered from the war. And he did something else too, something that shows you how sophisticated his economic thinking was. He provided services that Memphis desperately needed but that many white business owners were too proud or too racist to provide. He opened his businesses to both black and white customers at a time when most establishments were segregated. He offered credit and banking services to people who couldn't get them from white-owned banks. He became, in essence, a one-man economic engine for a city that was struggling to rebuild. The white elite of Memphis watched this happen with a mixture of disbelief, resentment, and grudging respect, because Church wasn't just becoming successful. He was becoming essential. And there's a profound irony here that you need to appreciate. The same white Southerners who had defended slavery by claiming that black people were intellectually inferior, incapable of managing their own affairs, dependent on white guidance for survival, these same people now found themselves doing business with, borrowing from, and economically dependent on a man who 10 years earlier had been classified as property. And Church's success wasn't an anomaly. He was part of a wave of black economic achievement during Reconstruction that terrified white supremacists precisely because it proved that the justifications for slavery had been lies all along. By 1870, Church's wealth exceeded that of most white men in Memphis, and by 1872, just 10 years after purchasing his freedom, he owned more property than the plantation owner who had once enslaved him, more than the wealthy white merchants who had dismissed him as incapable of business acumen, more than the Confederate officers who had fought to keep him in chains, and the way he did it, the specific strategies he employed, they reveal something crucial about black economic genius under oppression. Church didn't just work hard. Thousands of enslaved and formerly enslaved people worked incredibly hard. Church worked smart. He saw opportunities where others saw obstacles. He built networks across racial lines when it served his interests. He diversified his investments. He reinvested his profits rather than consuming them. He understood that in a capitalist system, capital compounds, and the person who can accumulate and deploy capital most effectively wins regardless of their race, and that terrified white supremacists because it meant the system they claimed was natural and inevitable could be beaten by the very people they claimed were inferior. But here's what makes Church's story even more remarkable. He didn't just accumulate wealth for himself. He used his wealth to lift up other black people in Memphis. He employed black workers. He extended credit to black entrepreneurs. He invested in black churches and schools. He became a pillar of Memphis's black community precisely because he understood that his individual success meant nothing if it didn't contribute to collective progress. And this is a pattern you see again and again in black economic history, from the entrepreneurs of Black Wall Street in Tulsa to the business owners of Durham's Black Wall Street to the investors of the National Negro Business League. Black wealth has always been about more than individual enrichment. It's been about building institutions, supporting communities, and creating opportunities for the next generation. Church's wealth continued to grow throughout the 1870s and 1880s, and by the time of his death in 1912, he was one of the wealthiest black men in America and wealthier than most white men in Tennessee. He owned hundreds of properties. He had helped establish banks. He had invested in schools and churches. He had created generational wealth that would benefit his descendants for decades, including his daughter Mary Church Terrell, who would become one of the most important civil rights activists of the early 20th century, and his son Robert Jr., who would become a successful banker and civil rights leader in his own right. And this is another part of the story that gets erased, the way that black economic success during and after Reconstruction created dynasties of black excellence that contributed to every aspect of American life despite facing continuous oppression and violence. You need to understand what happened next, because this is where the story takes a darker turn. Throughout the South in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Black economic success became a target. Wealthy Black communities like Rosewood, Florida were burned to the ground. Prosperous Black business districts like Tulsa's Greenwood were destroyed by white mobs. Black-owned property was seized through legal manipulation and outright theft. Black entrepreneurs were driven out of business through violence and intimidation, and laws were passed specifically designed to strip Black people of their economic gains, including grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes, and Jim Crow segregation laws that made it nearly impossible for Black businesses to compete with white businesses. And this wave of economic terrorism was a direct response to stories like Church's, because if Black people could become wealthier than their former masters, if they could succeed in capitalism despite facing obstacles that would have destroyed most people, then what did that say about white supremacy? What did that say about the natural order that Jim Crow was supposedly protecting? What did that say about who deserved America's wealth and opportunities? The erasure of these stories from mainstream American history isn't accidental, it's strategic, because acknowledging that hundreds, perhaps thousands of formerly enslaved people achieved remarkable economic success during Reconstruction would require acknowledging several uncomfortable truths. First, that slavery wasn't necessary for Black people to be productive. They were always capable of creating wealth. They were just prevented from keeping it. Second, that many of the wealthy white families of the South built their fortunes not through superior business acumen but through the ability to legally steal the labor of Black workers. Third, that when given even limited opportunities, Black Americans demonstrated economic genius that rivaled or exceeded that of their white counterparts. And fourth, that the system of Jim Crow and segregation that followed Reconstruction wasn't about maintaining order or protecting anyone. It was about preventing Black economic competition and preserving white economic dominance through violence and legal oppression. Church's story is one of thousands that need to be told. There was William Ellison, born into slavery in South Carolina, who bought his freedom in 1816, became a successful cotton gin manufacturer, and by 1860 owned 63 enslaved people himself and had wealth that exceeded that of most white planters in his county. A disturbing example of how some Black people participated in slavery, but also a testament to the business acumen that Black Americans demonstrated when given opportunity. There was Tommy LaFawn, born free in New Orleans in 1810, who became a real estate investor and merchant, and by his death in 1893, had accumulated a fortune worth nearly $500,000, which he left to charity. There was Annie Malone, born just after the Civil War, who built a hair care empire that made her one of the wealthiest Black women in America and possibly the wealthiest Black woman of her time. Wealthier even than Madam C.J. Walker, who is more commonly celebrated. There was O.W. Gurley, who founded Greenwood in Tulsa and created the conditions for Black Wall Street to flourish until white rioters destroyed it in 1921. And there were thousands of others, farmers who bought land from their former masters, entrepreneurs who started businesses with money saved from wages earned during slavery, investors who saw opportunities in the chaos of Reconstruction and had the courage to seize them. What all these stories share is a common thread. Black people didn't need white paternalism to succeed economically. They needed white people to stop actively preventing their success. And when circumstances aligned to give them even limited economic freedom, they demonstrated the same drive, intelligence, creativity, and business acumen as anyone else, except they did it while facing obstacles that would have crushed most people: legal discrimination, social ostracism, physical violence, lack of access to capital, inability to enforce contracts, property that could be seized at any time, businesses that could be destroyed by mobs with no legal recourse, and the constant psychological burden of living in a society that declared them inferior while simultaneously fearing and resenting their success. The lesson of Robert Church Sr.'s story isn't just that one man became wealthy, it's that the system of slavery and the Jim Crow system that followed it weren't protecting white people from Black economic competition, they were protecting white people from having to compete with Black people on a level playing field. Because when that competition happened, even on a field tilted dramatically in favor of white people, Black Americans often won, and that's what Jim Crow was really about: not separation but economic domination, not protection but exploitation. not natural order but artificial advantage maintained through violence and law. Today, when you hear people talk about the racial wealth gap, about how the median white family has 10 times the wealth of the median black family, remember that this gap wasn't created by differences in work ethic, intelligence, or business acumen. It was created by centuries of legal and illegal wealth extraction, by slavery that stole the labor and therefore the wealth accumulation of millions of black people, by Jim Crow that destroyed black businesses and communities, by redlining that prevented black families from buying homes in areas where property values would appreciate, by discriminatory lending that charged black borrowers higher interest rates, by employment discrimination that kept black workers in lower-paying jobs, by educational segregation that denied black children access to quality schools, and by 1,000 other ways that the system was rigged to transfer wealth from black communities to white communities. And the remarkable thing isn't that a wealth gap exists. The remarkable thing is that despite all of this, black Americans have created extraordinary wealth, built thriving businesses, established institutions, and demonstrated economic resilience that should be studied and celebrated. Robert Church Sr.'s story, the story of a man who went from being property to property owner in a single decade, from enslaved to wealthier than his enslaver in 10 years. It's not just a feel-good tale of individual triumph, it's evidence of a massive historical cover-up, proof that the narratives we were taught about black economic dependence and white economic superiority were lies designed to justify oppression. And understanding his story, sharing his story, remembering his story and the stories of thousands like him. It's not just about correcting the historical record, it's about understanding the present, because the systems that were designed to prevent black economic success didn't disappear when Jim Crow ended. They evolved, they became more subtle, they were coded in different language, but the goal remained the same: to preserve economic advantage through any means necessary. And recognizing that reality, confronting that reality honestly, is the only way to build a system that actually rewards merit regardless of race. So remember Robert Church Sr., remember that he existed, remember what he achieved. Remember that he did it while facing obstacles designed to make it impossible. Remember that he wasn't alone, that there were thousands like him whose stories deserve to be told. And remember that these stories were buried, erased, written out of history books not by accident but by design, because they threatened a narrative that powerful people needed you to believe. And when you share this story, when you tell people about the slave who became richer than his master in 10 years, you're not just sharing an interesting historical anecdote, you're striking a blow against that erasure. You're reclaiming a history that was stolen. You're honoring the memory of people who achieved the impossible and then had their achievements forgotten. And you're contributing to a more complete, more honest, more truthful understanding of American history and the extraordinary capabilities of Black Americans when given even the smallest opportunity to succeed.